You already know about the situation in Ukraine.
Russia's launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Специальной военной операции.
The war in Ukraine.
Ukraine.
The war has been the main topic of almost every media outlet over the past month now, but in this video I want to focus on another aspect that in many ways is more about the EU than Ukraine itself. Ukraine's application for EU membership. On February 28th, the Ukrainian President Zelensky officially signed his country's application to the EU. This was soon followed by an open letter signed by 8 Eastern European countries to give Ukraine immediate candidate status. And this was then followed by a bunch of articles warning that Ukraine shouldn't be given false hopes since it would have to address a lot of problems and the application process usually takes years. So what do you actually need to do to join the EU? Central to the so-called accession process are the Copenhagen criteria, and these consist of a political, economic, and legal part. First, the country needs to have democratic, stable institutions, rule of law, human rights, and protection of minorities. Second, a functioning market economy that can cope with competition and market forces. And third, it has to implement the so-called acquis, which is the accumulation of EU laws, rights, obligations, and so on and so on. After that, the European Council, European Parliament, national parliaments of each member state then have to vote to accept the country into the EU. And this is why commentators have said that a fast-track process, like Zelensky proposed, would mean that, quote, the whole accession process would have to be simplified and overhauled, increasing the risk of a subpar, rushed procedure that leads to watered-down standards and a sketchy adaptation of EU rules. But what if I told you that this has already happened before, even without a fast-track procedure? Let's talk about Poland. So in 2004, Poland and 7 other post-communist states joined the European Union after years of negotiations going back to the 90s. But there was a problem. At the time of joining, Poland still didn't comply with a lot of EU rules and regulations. Just considering the economic part alone, over 250 EU directives regulating the single market were still not implemented. But this didn't come out of nowhere. A year before the country was supposed to join, a Commission report warned that key pieces of legislation still needed to be implemented. But it still took the EU Commission over a year to sue Poland for its failure to fulfill telecommunication directives, which is just a drop in the bucket. But how could this happen? Remember what I said about the Copenhagen criteria? The thing is that what passes as stable democratic institutions or a free market economy is up to the interpretation of whoever is negotiating with the candidate country. Taking a quantitative measure, such as the democracy index or a freedom of the press score, as it is done, for example, with the inflation, GDP, exchange rates, or the euro convergence, would already help to evaluate the candidate's stability more objectively. Some critics have pointed out that the reason for the lack of quantitative measures for the accession process might be that it simply takes less time and costs less money. Also, since the strict criteria weren't used for previous enlargements, why would you use them now? But still you might ask, how could Poland join when it was known that they violate so many EU directives? The key lies in a 2002 strategy paper by the European Commission, which says acceding countries need to implement the acquis by the date of the accession, except in cases where transitional agreements have been agreed. And this was the case in Poland. But Poland wasn't the only example of a haphazard verification. In 2007, Bulgaria and Romania joined the EU, but corruption was still so bad in these countries that the EU Commission set up benchmarks for them to meet within 3 years, along with monitoring of the implementation.
In the same time, it was another kind of utopia, considering that once joining the EU, all problems will be solved. After concluding the negotiations, continuing with this utopia, we failed to prepare the country for the modernity, while the problems, and many problems still remain unsolved or improperly solved.
Well, that failed, and both countries are being monitored to this day. Despite that, in 2019, the Commission praised Bulgaria for its efforts against corruption and renewed its commitment to admit it into the Schengen area. Unfortunately, after all these experiences, the EU hasn't gotten any stricter in how they use the criteria. A study from 2020 looked at the current accession negotiations with Montenegro and Serbia, and found that expansion is pursued with a, quote, minimalist approach to democracy. As a consequence, these countries have, quote, only sought to accomplish the least possible level of reforms necessary to satisfy these minimal conditions, leading to a low quality of democracy even in late stages of the negotiation process. There's another country that shows us how risky this can be. In recent years, Hungary has proved to be a challenge to the leaders of the EU. Since the rise to power of Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán in 2010, the country's political culture has shifted away from that of the EU, or as he describes it, we're not Western, not liberal, and maybe not democratic, but highly successful. With a growing anti-immigrant sentiment since the 2015 migrant crisis, the right-wing government passed the Stop Soros legislation in 2018 that criminalizes support for asylum seekers and just defies EU law. Although that's not the only defiance. Since last year, Hungary has grown to be quite popular at the EU's top court, which has ruled that the country is criminalizing its civilians for helping the migrants, that Hungary has failed to fight corruption, and this year, the EU is still trying to convince Orbán's party to change the LGBTQ laws that literally violate human rights. But until this point, the Union failed to make any significant difference to Hungary's politics, even after stripping it of a €7.2 billion recovery fund to deal with the COVID pandemic. Ironically, a major roadblock to effectively punishing a country like Hungary is the democratic process needed to enact sanctions. Since the EU has no way of expelling a country from the Union, the only option they have is to strip the country of all its rights and responsibilities while still maintaining EU membership. This approach is described in Article 7 of the Treaty of the European Union and is otherwise labeled as the nuclear option. It was originally introduced by Austria and Italy just before the 2004 enlargement as a possibility for such new members like Hungary to be stripped of all their rights. You know, just in case. It's almost as if they knew that Hungary wasn't the best candidate in the first place. Article 7 was first put into use against Hungary in 2018. However, to reach the part where sanctions are put into practice, it needs a unanimous vote from the EU Council, which was vetoed by Poland. Incidentally, Poland is currently seeing disintegration of democratic standards as well, complete with undermining of the independence of its judiciary and restricting minority rights. Yeah, and this time the EU really has backed itself into a corner. It can't effectively sanction Hungary without the support of all other countries, including Poland. But Poland is blocking every sanctioning attempt, because it knows it will be the next head on the chopping block. All the more reasons to make sure that new members have democratic institutions that are as stable as possible. So let's bring this whole thing back to Ukraine. What does this all mean for Ukraine's wish to join the EU? On the one hand, the country certainly has to tackle a lot of issues before a membership would be possible. The Corruption Perception Index ranks the country as the second most corrupt state in Europe. Its low score in the Democracy Index earns it the label of hybrid regime, and Reporters Without Borders have continuously criticized that the oligarchs still control a large part of the media landscape. On the other hand, the EU's past leniency towards candidates that didn't comply with the Copenhagen criteria suggests that Ukraine might get accepted as a member while only partially addressing these problems. Even though a fast-track procedure has now been ruled out, a number of Eastern European members still want Ukraine to join as soon as possible. On the other side, Germany and France are more reluctant. Emmanuel Macron even said that with all this backsliding of democracy in Poland and Hungary, and with the lack of unity in foreign policy, treaties need to be reformed before any new enlargement can take place. So right now, Ukraine can either be a risk or a chance for the EU. The country can be admitted with only lax requirements and potentially turn into a new Poland or Hungary, or the EU can help to turn Ukraine into a strong and lively democracy that doesn't only uplift its own people, but also serves as a beacon for those fighting for democratic change in Belarus and Russia. Let's hope it's the second option.